So we're going into the first chapter of the last section, which has to do with real-world applications, I guess. Although the cancer, I guess, was a real-world application chapter. Here I'm going to talk about, you're in a class for science majors. What do you do with a science major? And got a few cartoons to put up. This one is how you see yourself, complex human being, hopes, dreams, aspirations. How most professors see you, brain, stick. So, how's research? If you go to my website, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is there. There's a page about careers, and I'm going to work my way up step by step. Right now, you are undergraduates. Whether you're at a community college or are in a four-year school. I mean, at community college, you get an associate's degree. You can't here because we can't generate enough pure science students to give, our science program had to be discontinued because by the second year, there weren't enough people to support classes. So basically, we are first-year training. That is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not as good as it might be, though. This is biology. If you were to go to, I'll talk about SUNY Albany since that's where I went and that's where my daughter transferred to, so I'm kind of familiar with it. But I've also been, in other universities and talked to people that have gone to other universities. And a lot of the stories I'm going to tell you are pretty universal. SUNY Albany, if you ask people coming in what they want to major in, the biggest number you get is business, and the second biggest number you get is biology. And most of those people would tell you that they are either pre-med or pre-vet. To which the powers that be look at this number in SUNY Albany when I started. Now this is back when I had to dodge mammoths to go to class. Is that there were 500 of potential biology students around me my first semester. The powers that be look at this group, which now I think numbers at SUNY Albany somewhere around 1,200. They look at this group and they go, so what are you? And they go, oh, I'm going to med school, I'm going to vet school. And their basic response is, no, you're not. Is that you don't have the chops, you don't have the ability, you don't have the motivation, you don't have the ambition to do that. And we're going to spend a couple of years proving that to you. So when I was a senior, after that was my fourth year, started with about 500 people, there were about 75 of us left. Now, I was lucky. I never intended to be going to medical school or veterinary school, so I wasn't competing and going nuts for grades and such. I was going to go into graduate school. But of the 75 people around me, I think maybe it was less than 20 of them actually applied to medical or veterinary school, and probably less than half of them got in. I didn't know every single one of them personally, so I don't know, but that would be typical. And which means that the rest of them were kind of going, well, what am I going to do now? When my daughter transferred to Albany, she transferred in essentially as a junior, third year, fourth year. And one of the friends she made there, I don't actually know what his name is because she always referred to him as hopeless pre-med because he was just kind of coasting through. He wasn't failing, but he wasn't particularly getting good grades, and he still kind of thought that he was pre-med, even though it was pretty obvious early on that he was not getting into medical school. I'll talk about that course in a bit. What I'm trying to get across is that science classes, especially biology classes and chemistry classes in large schools, are very, very, very difficult, and they mean them to be very, very difficult. They're going to lose a lot of students who are going to go in and not make it out with a passing grade, and they are happy with that. They don't expect to have 1,000 people in fourth year classes. They don't have the lab capacity, they don't have the personnel. So there is a perfectly purposeful weeding out process that happens. And in most universities, you get what you call the precipitate areas, where people wash out and they go into education, or they go into English, or they go into, sometimes they go into business, although that's a little bit more competitive. But they find other things to do. They do wind up graduating from college. They just don't graduate with a science degree. Which is not necessarily a bad thing. Is my wife started in biology, and for the first year of chemistry, she went, I guess maybe I'm not gonna be biology. And she did eventually graduate with an English and theater degree at a time when computers were just getting rolling, and people didn't have really computer degrees. She got jobs in the industry and is now a very high-powered computer person, someone they call an information architect. Yeah. She's at a level where they give them really cool names. Anyway, it's gonna be tough. One of my students here transferred to, he wanted to be pre-med. He did what the good stuff is that, with my advice, I will admit, Upstate Medical in Syracuse had information sessions. They probably do, they're probably Zoom meetings now, but you can actually go and sit with admissions counselors at the medical school and talk to them. He was able to ask them, so what are you actually looking for in an application? Because everybody who's gonna make it past the first level has got really, really good grades and really, really good test scores. And so they were able to tell him that there's a lot of extra stuff, and that not every school is taken as seriously as every other school. There's only like 6 schools in New York State that if you did really, really well there, it really, really helps. Other schools, if you did really, really well there, it doesn't necessarily have the weight of that. If you're curious, it's mostly the 4 centers, the university centers, which is Albany, Stony Brook, Buffalo, and what's the last one? I don't remember what the last one is. Also Geneseo, which is not a university center. Cornell is good. And then there's other private schools like Union and RPI, which actually you can get in and get into a program where you can actually, as an undergraduate, be starting medical school. Really, really, really competitive. But he transferred to SUNY Binghamton. Binghamton was the 4th one. And he wound up getting into some trouble. He had trouble adapting, and when he went for help, the basic attitude they got is, oh, you're pre-med, leave us alone. Is that if you want support, become a chemistry major. Is that we're not in the business of helping you graduate. If you need help to be pre-med, then you're not gonna make it in medical school anyway. And that's kind of the attitude that you run into. There's a lot of basic classes that you wind up having to take. You take biology, but several levels of chemistry, usually a year of physics, not always calculus-based physics, but there's math requirements. There used to be language requirements, but those have kind of fallen by the wayside. And there are other requirements that, general education requirements that you're gonna need. My suggestion always is get those out of the way early. If you're in high school, if you have friends in high school that are still there and they have AP opportunities, if they want to be science people, don't take AP science. Take AP English, take AP history. And then you have some of your gen ed requirements out of the way. You get college credit for those, and you can concentrate on the sciences. On top of that, most high school science teachers do not have degrees in science. They have a couple of courses in science, and very often not a real solid beginning. To me, what I'm teaching here, there's a whole basic language and a set of concepts you need in your head to be able to work your way up and not have to look everything up on your phone. And you don't always get those from AP courses in high schools. Not to mention that heavy-duty science programs don't respect AP grades. Very rarely do they transfer in with full weight. And one of my friends who went to RPI also said, if you were to come in with a lot of courses already on the books, and so you started with sophomore courses, RPI is a relatively small school. By the end of the freshman year, everybody knows each other. You're in there as an incoming sophomore. Everybody, it's harder to make friends. Everybody already knows each other. Nobody knows you. You're kind of a freshman, but you're not a freshman. And so again, there's a lot of reasons to, if you're going to go into the sciences, not come in with science credits already booked. So from a four-year school, you get a bachelor's degree. Bachelor's degree, my bachelor's degree is in biology with chemistry as a second field. It's not quite the same thing as a minor, major minor. Chemistry's a little stronger there. That's typical. There's not a lot you can do with a bachelor's degree in a science. You work at a lab, you can as a lab tech. But beyond that, not a lot. Most people are aiming at some sort of specialty school, medical school. Medical school, my student found out, wants you to kind of show them that you know what you're getting in for. They very much look for people with experience in the field. Somebody who's been an EMT, who's worked in a doctor's office, or has other types of experience where they kind of know how everything sort of works. Veterinary school is harder to get into than med school. Probably your best option there is to get into a bridge program where, like Cobleskill has, where if you finish a Cobleskill with where a certain threshold of grades, your chances of getting into a couple of vet schools that they have connections with are greatly increased. Cornell is the same way. Cornell has its own veterinary school. But there's way fewer slots. So there may not be as many applicants as there are to med school, but there's way fewer slots for veterinary school. And again, if you've worked in a vet's office, that's going to help you. Is if you have experience with animals, that's going to help you. Dentistry, other kinds of optometry, there's a whole bunch of biology-related schools you can go to that are going to cost you a lot of money. You're going to take out probably a lot of loans and be paying those loans off. It'll be like starting your career with a mortgage and no house. You have a career, but you're going to be paying that off for a long time. The other option, the option that I went through, is to go to graduate school, somewhere where you can get an advanced degree, a master's degree, a PhD, Doctor of Philosophy. Now, I'll give you this advice. I gave this to my daughter, and it did not work out so well, and I'll tell you why, but I'm going to give you the advice anyway. This is just, through my genius, I will transform this lifeless mass into a being of pure academic rigor. They will tremble before my name. Arrogant, they called me. Drunk on illusions of grandeur and godhood. I said, duh, I'm a professor. Of course I think I'm a god. When you apply to graduate school, you're applying to the department. You're not applying to a general admissions office, which is looking at thousands and thousands of people trying to come in as undergraduates. So you get a bunch of applications and they sort through them. How do you figure out where you want to go? As an undergraduate, you need to come up with some idea of what sort of area you want to go into. Is that, although my university didn't have a designated invertebrate zoology program, they gave enough options that I could put together what was essentially an invertebrate zoology concentration as an undergraduate. And then that's what I looked for. I looked for graduate programs that had invertebrate zoology, which turned out to be, I wanted to stay reasonably close, so this side of the Mississippi. And there were grand total of 4 programs that I could apply to, which, and I wound up going to the University of Memphis, about as, it's on this side of the Mississippi. You can see the Mississippi from Memphis. In fact, West Memphis is on the other side. Now, it turns out I picked something very, very specialized. I was the only person that applied under that specialty in that particular year. So, all the grades and marks and stuff turned out not to be all that important. I didn't know that at the time, but sometimes if you pick something really, really specific, it can help. But if you find something you're interested in, get online, do some reading, find out who's doing the interesting work, find out where they're doing the interesting work. If you can, set up an appointment and go and talk to them. I know with COVID, that's not, it will be possible by the time you're actually in a position, like going into your senior year, you can do this. I took my daughter up to Vermont in Burlington, and she and the guy doing the research got on really, really well. And he said, I'll look for your application when you come through. And we thought that was a really good thing. She wanted to go into plants. It turns out there's very, very few plant programs left in the United States. He was one of them working on ferns. What we did not know, which is now a little bit different than it used to be, is that I have another friend, she worked in somebody's lab. Undergraduate research can be really useful too. It's a lot of schools offer undergraduate research programs where you go and you work in somebody's lab and do, learn techniques, learn how labs work, get a little bit of experience writing papers. She worked with somebody that I had worked with years ago in graduate school. And we got a little bit of an insight into applying to graduate school, which is they sort through the applications. Well, what we then learned was the first thing they look at is there's an entrance exam called the Graduate Record Exam, GREs. Kind of like the SATs, but a lot more specific. And there's a general version and a science-specific version. My daughter's terrible at standardized tests. She always has been. She's very smart. She knows her stuff. Doesn't do well on standardized tests. Didn't do well on the GREs. And from what we learned from my old colleague, sometimes that's as far into the process as you're going to get. It comes and lands on some professor's desk and they go too low, too low, too low, too low, too low. Oh, we got like 20 left here. And that apparently is what happened to her. She never got a call back from Vermont. So I don't even know that the guy she talked to ever even saw her application come across the desk. So, and it makes no sense. Once you're into graduate school, standardized testing is ridiculous. It's not the brightest way to get people into college in the first place. It's a really stupid way to get people into graduate school. But another thing we learned from my old colleague is eventually there's a committee of professors that have to sort through the entrance and figure out who's coming in. And that's not really their job, and they don't really like to do it. And they do it as quickly and as sloppily as they can get away with. So anything that they can use to eliminate people, they're, low score, they will do that. So it's a much trickier thing. I do believe that the mistake we made is if my daughter had called and kept following up with him and told him, my GRE scores are bad, I'm bad on standardized tests, it might have gone differently. I don't know that she would have been happy in graduate school, but. So graduate school, you get in. You travel somewhere. Chances are you're not going to be close to home. And you are assigned. Different graduate schools assign different ways. But basically, for an advanced degree, you're going to have to do research. You're going to have to publish. You're going to have to work in somebody's lab under their supervision. This is, you see, I don't expect my students to have a life outside the lab. I didn't, and neither should you. Then why did the grad school application form ask about extracurricular activities? Because I didn't write the application. Is crying considered a hobby? I'll read this in a second. Different graduate schools have different approaches. I have a friend who went to Columbia. In Columbia, they bring you in and you go through a rotation for like a part of a semester. You'll be working, basically doing grunt work, glassware, washing and stuff in one lab, and then another lab, and then another lab, and another lab, and then you can kind of pick where you want to go, provided they want you to go there. Whereas I went immediately into a lab, working under we called a major professor, what very often is now called a principal investigator, a PI. And I didn't realize I was the only applicant. They were actually kind of arguing over who would get me. I wound up working with a parasitologist, which is why my concentration wound up being parasitology. I didn't wind up working in his particular area of research, which was amoebas that eat your brain. But, so I had to kind of figure it out as I went along. And that is sometimes, it's like, your thesis must be an original piece of work, but not too original. I can't make sure you don't embarrass me. It must be new and groundbreaking, yet follow the same vision and protocols I established decades ago. So when you say original, you actually mean more of the same, but different. That is a much more typical experience in graduate school. You wind up working in somebody's lab and doing some small aspect of their established research, and hopefully getting something new and interesting enough that you can publish on it. But you're kind of very constrained by what you can and can't do, because they have stuff that they want to get done, and they're more supervisors rather than researchers at this point. Now, my friend at Columbia was given a lot of choices that didn't like that. So she was very uncomfortable. I kind of liked having lots of choices. I wound up working with a couple of different major professors because I was doing stuff that neither one of them really knew that much about. But it worked out okay. And I wound up having to change what I was doing about 4 different times, because that's what happens. You come in with an idea and you go, well, okay, that's not working. Let me see if I can shift it over here. Research should be the sole focus of your life. I expect you to eat, drink, and sleep research. I'm allowed to sleep? Only in a lie awake at night obsessing over it kind of way. Outside interests only tell me you're not serious about getting your PhD. I mean, what could be more interesting than our research? I can't answer that. Exactly, nothing. And that is not an unusual attitude. Now, in some systems, there's two levels, and you can get in and get a master's, and from the master's you go on to the PhD, or from the master's you graduate, you transfer somewhere and get a PhD. And in some, it's a combined program. You're really in there to get a PhD. If you wash out of it early, they may give you a master's degree. Master's degrees are useful for some levels of teaching. Community colleges are good for masters. I've worked in a PhD program for a while and found out I really enjoyed teaching better than researching, and it was much more research oriented. But that's another thing. When you go to graduate school, you're not paying anymore. You may have run up debt as an undergrad, but hopefully you got a loan that will not kick in until you've actually graduated from school. But typically they pay you to go to school in graduate school. They have what are called assistantships. The most common is a teaching assistantship, which is what I had. I'll come back to that in a second. Some people are paid to work in the lab. And so they have much more expanded responsibilities, not just for their research, but for doing other stuff in the lab. That's a research assistantship. At its best, they pay you a decent stipend. It isn't a lot of money, but they also cover, if you're living on campus, room and board in some cases, books and supplies in some cases. It varies, a lot from place to place. And it is something that when the time comes, you want to find out what they will and won't support. In some situations, if you're a teaching assistant, Memphis, where I went as for my master's, They basically looked at your background and said, here, usually when you go to undergraduate, you take labs separate from your lectures. And the labs are generally taught by teaching assistants who, you don't know this at the time, but they just graduated and they don't really have any training or experience teaching. Sometimes they don't have a great grasp of the English language. Welcome to physics. But they're in charge of teaching you the labs. And sometimes in Memphis, it was like, here's what we're doing, go figure it out. And like my first semester, my first assignment, I've got like a week and a half to get ready for this, is I'm teaching senior level vertebrate embryology. I'm an invertebrate person. I didn't take vertebrate zoology. I don't have training or any kind of background in this. And when I went to the guy who was supervising the graduate TAs and said, that's not my background. And he got a sheet out and he went, oh yeah, I read it wrong. We don't have anybody else to do it. You're still doing it. So I had to teach myself vertebrate embryology and just try to stay ahead of the students. Fortunately, it's very visual. You have to be able to translate sections into three-dimensional spaces in terms of slices of embryos, and my brain does that fairly well, so it wasn't that difficult to learn. And the best thing that ever happened to me was when Professor Simcoe, who I saw only once or twice in the whole semester, he was teaching the lecture, but he wandered into the lab one day, like 3-4 weeks in, and Professor Simcoe, what's this? And I looked, he'd look through the scope and go, I don't know. And I'd been saying that to people because slices are not always that easy to read, but I got the feeling, especially from how many times they asked this during his little visit, I don't know, I was thinking this is not really a good thing to be answering when I don't, but I tend to be honest. But it turns out you can't always see what you're supposed to see in a particular slice. That the I don't know answer is a perfectly viable answer if you don't know. And I don't know, but I'll find out is a better answer if it's something that can be fixed. And then I wound up doing that for the whole rest of my career at Memphis, where if they didn't have anybody with any background to teach something, they'd give it to me and I'd learn it like 3 days before I had to teach human anatomy and physiology to a group that was coming in 5 days a week for 4 weeks. Fun. But, I was getting paid for it. I was working in the lab. I was enjoying it. You don't realize how great being in school is until you're out of school. I'm only sort of out of school now. I had worked for a number of years between high school and college, so, I kind of had dealt with the real world. Actually, I settled in Memphis for 6 months before I started school there, and I worked in a mattress factory. Through the summer of Memphis without air conditioning, that's working. Anyway, so you're not going to be paid great, but you're going to be doing okay. All students, faculty, and staff from the Office of the President. Due to severe weather conditions, classes have been canceled for today. All faculty and staff offices will remain closed until further notice. Graduate students, of course, are still expected to work. The administration. That is how it works, is that you're not being a graduate student and doing research is not a 9-to-5 job. It is a do it when you need to do it, get it done. And if that involves 12-hour days, 15-hour days, 4-hour days, then that's what you need to do. And it'll vary a lot, depending on what you're doing at any given moment. When I came to Albany State, I went as an undergrad, I came back as a PhD student, then I was a teaching assistant, but the teaching assistants were much more supervised. Is that I would be in a classroom and the professor would come in and kind of, like I do, walk through the lab for everybody. And then he would leave and the graduate students would help. That's actually when I worked with the guy that my daughter worked with eventually. And I kind of felt like Vanna White on Wheel of Fortune. Just kind of, you help people in the lab with stuff, but I was kind of used to being much more autonomous. Discovered I liked actually being the voice of education in a room. and not so much working on a set of research where we were kind of scrambling around and fumbling and not really finding anything really good to work on. So I decided to leave and actually taught high school for a few years. Then found out after I went to the trouble of getting my high school certification that somebody with a graduate degree in the subject area already and several years of high school teaching experience was way too expensive to pay when compared to somebody who was fresh out of an undergraduate program with 5 months of supervised student teaching. So high school turned out not to be a viable option for me, but so I wound up here teaching at a community college. PhDs go on to, I know this is running really long, but I want it to be all on one thing. PhDs work in the government sometimes. It all depends on your field. And that's another thing you have to consider is where the work is. Because some PhDs can only get jobs as professors, which means they have to come in with a body of work. They have to usually come in with grant money kind of either on the horizon or already established. Very often they wind up being what's called postdocs, which is they go and work as basically upper level graduate students in somebody else's lab while they scramble around trying to find an actual job for their PhD. And then when they do get a job at a university, they have to keep their grant level up. Money comes into the university through the grants. It's very important. They need to get published. They call it publish or perish because you get like a probationary period of 5 or 6 years. And at the end of that, they decide whether they want to keep you around or not. And if they do, you got tenure and you're a little bit safer at that point. But work with an advanced graduate degree is not certain. You don't absolutely know that you're going to get a decent job quickly when you've gotten a doctorate in a particular science. Again, it all depends on the specialty. If you open the back of Science magazine and look at the jobs available or go online and look for jobs for PhDs, you'll notice they tend to be very specific. They're looking for a molecular biology specialist with a experience in bioluminescence and stuff like that. So it can be very, very tricky. But that's basically how science careers work. I think that will do it for this particularly long video.